Maya Lawson was running late again, the usual rush of the city morning, crowds, the honking cars, and the flashing lights, as the city seemed to move faster than her own thoughts. She had an important meeting today. It could change the trajectory of her career, and the last thing she wanted was to be delayed by something as trivial as traffic. She pushed the accelerator as her mind raced through her to-do list and her expectations for the day. Her phone buzzed, but she ignored it. The road ahead was crowded but manageable. She was focused on the task ahead, making sure her mind stayed sharp when suddenly flashing red and blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror. She sighed and pulled over the car to the side of the road. The tension in her shoulders was immediate. Her stomach tightened a little. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the officer approaching the car, his face partially obscured by the bright sun, but she could tell he was still looking at her closely through the mirror. He knocked on her window. She pressed the button, and it slid down with a slight squeak. A routine stop, she thought as she pulled her wallet from her bag and handed it over with a professional smile, a standard exchange he had experienced hundreds of times before, but this time felt different. There was something in the air. Perhaps it was the weight of the day pressing on her, or maybe the officer's presence, which felt more invasive than usual. He looked at her license and registration with a furrowed brow. There was a slight pause before he spoke. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm issuing a citation today for not signaling when changing lanes. I'm sure you're aware of it." I wasn't sure if he was trying to be stern or if he was simply going through the motions, but his tone carried something more than the usual exchange. It felt like an oversight on his part, but he was still going to follow through. The way he looked at her made it clear that he thought she might be one of those people who would argue or resist. But she didn't. She was calm, collected, almost too composed for such a moment of routine discomfort. She nodded and explained, without raising her voice, "I understand, officer, and I do apologize. It won't happen again," she added in the most neutral voice she could manage. The officer didn't seem to be listening, though his gaze shifted slightly, as if he were trying to determine whether she was going to protest or make some sort of excuse. But she didn't give him that satisfaction. She simply remained still and respectful. The seconds felt like minutes as he finished writing the citation. But it wasn't about the fine. It wasn't even about the fact that she had been pulled over on this busy morning. It was the way he looked at her, the way he seemed to judge her before knowing anything about her. It was that tiny moment of discomfort that made her feel like an outsider, like she had been reduced to nothing more than a woman in a car who was just another name to mark on his ticket book. When he handed her the citation, she took it from him with a nod and a polite thank you and watched as he walked back to his patrol car. Her heart was still racing, but not from fear or anxiety, more from the unfairness of it. All that quiet judgment. She had felt his gaze linger for just a moment longer than necessary, as if he had been studying her face, trying to understand her, as if she could be so easily defined. Maya entered the courthouse with a quiet sense of anticipation that quickly turned into frustration. She had been here before, navigating the labyrinth of legal proceedings for years, but never as the person under scrutiny. As she made her way to the waiting area, her heels clicking on the marble floors, she tried to shake off the nerves creeping into her thoughts. Today wasn't about a landmark case or a courtroom victory. Today was about a minor ticket, a small matter. But as she looked around, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The room was filled with an odd mix of people, some avoiding eye contact, others nervously checking their phones, and a few others whose confidence radiated through the space. She sat down in a seat toward the back of the room, taking a deep breath. Her mind flashed back to the events of the morning, how she had been stalked by the officer, and the subtle discomfort she had felt under his gaze. There was something unsettling about the way he had sized her up, as if she were another type of person. Even in this room, surrounded by strangers, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was being looked at differently. She wasn't just here for a traffic issue. She was here as a black woman in a system that often failed to see her as anything more than that. When her name was finally called, Maya stood and walked to the front of the room. The judge was already seated, scanning over a pile of papers in front of him. His name, Judge Carson, was etched onto the wooden podium in front of him. He didn't even look up as she approached the stand. Maya remained composed, her back straight and her posture unwavering. She was used to being the only black woman in rooms like this, used to making sure her presence was felt, even when others didn't seem to notice. Judge Carson glanced up briefly, his gaze cool and impersonal. Maya Lawson, he said flatly, you are here today for failing to signal during a lane change. Do you admit to this infraction? Maya nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I acknowledge the error, she said with a steady voice. I apologize for not signaling, and I will be more mindful in the future. Judge Carson didn't seem to be paying much attention to her words. His eyes flicked briefly to the paperwork in front of him and then back to Maya, as if waiting for her to say something else. There was a subtle condescension in his demeanor, as if he had already made up his mind about her. She could feel it, the subtle shift in how he regarded her, not just as someone facing a minor fine, but as someone beneath him, perhaps someone he assumed would be defensive, argumentative, or worse, someone he could dismiss easily. I see, he said, his tone more curt than before. I'll make it simple. You'll pay the fine and be on your way. Maya's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't let it show. There was no point in fighting it, not here, not now. She had learned long ago that there was a time to speak up and a time to stay silent, and today was a day for restraint. She didn't want to escalate things, but the words hung in the air. Asterisk, you will pay the fine and be on your way. Asterisk, the simplicity of it was maddening. She wasn't just a woman of character and intellect. To him, she was just another case to be resolved quickly, another name on a docket. She wasn't someone who could command the respect she had earned in her career. Not here, not in this moment. As the judge prepared to move on to the next case, Maya took a deep breath. She had always been told to take the high road, to ignore the slights that came her way, but something inside her stirred. This wasn't about a fine or a minor mistake. It was about the subtle, insidious ways the system treated her differently. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, the centuries of judgment and the barriers that had been placed in her path. But she didn't let it show. Not yet. Today, she would simply take her leave, but soon things would change. As the judge moved on to the next case, Maya felt a strange sense of detachment wash over her. She nodded politely to the officer at the door and made her way out of the courtroom. The harsh click of her heels echoed in the hallway as she passed by rows of empty chairs, her mind racing with thoughts that had little to do with the fine she had just received. In that sterile, muted courtroom, she had been just another face, another case to close. But there was more in her, so much more. Maya had fought for every inch of respect she had earned, and yet here she was, treated as though she was invisible, as though her achievements meant nothing compared to the judgment of a man who didn't even know her name. Maya paused as she stepped into the corridor, her hand brushing against the cold stone wall. She had already begun to walk out of the courthouse when a voice called out behind her. "Excuse me, Ms. Lawson." It was a woman's voice, a bit hesitant but unmistakable. Maya turned to see a young lawyer, dressed in a sharp suit, standing in the doorway. She looked nervous but intrigued, a mixture of excitement and disbelief in her eyes. "Yes?" Maya asked, slightly taken aback. I couldn't help but notice," the lawyer began, her words stumbling over each other. "Are you, Maya Lawson, the Supreme Court nominee?" The realization hit Maya like a sudden wave crashing against a shore. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she just stood there, not quite sure what to say. The fact that her nomination had been kept under wraps for so long made her feel protective of it. She hadn't expected it to surface so soon, especially not like this, in a courthouse of all places. Yes, Maya replied, her voice steady despite the surprise that echoed through her mind. "I'm Maya Lawson, but I'm not sure how this concerns you, Ms." "Right," the lawyer answered quickly, glancing around nervously before continuing. I saw your name in the news this morning. I didn't realize it was **U** standing in the courtroom just now. I'm so sorry for what just happened. That Judge Carson, I don't know how he missed it. You're a Supreme Court nominee, and he treated you like just another person who walked into that room." Maya felt a pang of frustration in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of clarity. She had always known that her path would be different. She had fought for every moment of success and opportunity, often faced with subtle doubts, assumptions, and prejudice. But this was different. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the recognition, The realization that this moment wasn't just about the unfair treatment she'd endured in that courtroom. It was about something bigger, something much bigger. The lawyer looked at her apologetically. I just wanted to say, I didn't know. But now that I know, I can't believe what happened. Maya smiled faintly, trying to mask the emotions bubbling inside her. She nodded, appreciating the kindness in the woman's voice, but it wasn't enough. There was nothing kind about being dismissed in that way, no matter how sincere the apology. Thank you, Maya said, her voice soft but firm. But it's not just about today. It's about what happens every day for people like me, for women like me. We're not just here to be dismissed or to fit into a mold, and I'll make sure my work speaks for itself. As she walked away, Maya's mind was already shifting gears. The encounter with Judge Carson was only the beginning. There would be more battles ahead, bigger ones, ones that would challenge everything she had worked so hard to achieve. But as the weight of the courthouse doors closed behind her, Maya knew that this moment, the moment when she had been overlooked, dismissed, and then recognized, would define not just her future, but the future of every person who had ever been judged by their appearance or background. She wouldn't let it go. Not this time. As Maya stepped out of the courthouse, the world outside seemed to move at a different pace. The sound of the traffic, the hum of the city, and the voices of strangers filled her ears, but they all felt distant, muffled. She could still feel the sting of Judge Carson's cold dismissal, the weight of his judgment. But now, in the aftermath of the confrontation, there was something else, something deeper, a realization that surged beneath her initial frustration. Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to reality. She pulled it from her bag and saw a text from her team. Maya, we've got a situation. Turn on the news. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She knew instantly what it was. The nomination. It had leaked. Her hands trembling, Maya tapped open the news app. The headline screamed at her. Asterisk. Maya Lawson nominated for U.S. Supreme Court. Asterisk. The article was brief but powerful, outlining her career, her rise through the legal ranks, and the significance of her nomination. There were mentions of her groundbreaking work, her leadership in pivotal cases, and her advocacy for civil rights. But it was the final line that caught her attention. Asterisk, in a surprising twist, Lawson's nomination comes after a controversial traffic stop and courtroom appearance that has raised questions about bias in the legal system. Asterisk, her mind reeled. The event that had felt so small, so insignificant, was now being linked to something much larger. She hadn't anticipated this. No one had. As she stood there, trying to make sense of it all, the reality of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't just a minor incident. This was the moment when her story had taken a turn. The story of a Black woman, poised to make history, facing subtle and systemic challenges at every turn. The story of a woman dismissed by a judge who had no idea who she was or what she represented. The story of a woman who would not let this moment define her, but who would use it to fuel the fire of change. Before Maya could digest the full weight of the news, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from her senior advisor. Maya, are you okay? The voice on the other end asked. The world's about to find out who you are, and we need to make sure your narrative stays true. I'm fine, Maya replied, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. Just processing. Listen, the advisor continued, there's no way around it now. This is bigger than we thought. You need to make a statement. Your words could change how people see this, how they see you, how they see asterisk as asterisk. Maya looked up at the courthouse in the distance. She could feel the eyes of the city on her, even though she knew she was just one person in a sea of many. The weight of her potential, her responsibility, and her past all seemed to merge at that moment. She was more than just a name in the headlines. She was a symbol of resilience, of perseverance, of everything that had been fought for, and everything that was still at risk. As she made her way to her car, her thoughts swirled. The public would now know who she was, and the moment of recognition would carry a new weight. She knew this wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about something far more significant. The world had already seen the headlines, but they didn't yet know her. They didn't know how hard she had worked for every opportunity, How many doors had been slammed in her face? How many people had underestimated her because of her race and gender? And yet, Maya wasn't angry. Not anymore. The anger had faded, replaced by a quiet determination. She would face the storm, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or disregarded. Her name would no longer be a footnote in someone else's narrative. She would take control of her story, and she would make sure that everyone saw her for who she truly was. A woman who wasn't just a Supreme Court nominee, she was a force to be reckoned with. The media frenzy exploded the moment the news broke. Maya's phone didn't stop buzzing, with dozens of calls, texts, and emails flooding in. Every news outlet seemed to have picked up the story, but the angle of the narrative was now a mix of admiration and controversy. Headlines from across the nation blared the same message. Asterisk. Maya Lawson, Supreme Court nominee, faces public backlash after traffic stop and courtroom incident. Asterisk. The story had gone viral almost instantly, and with it, Maya found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't anticipated. But despite the chaos, Maya remained calm. Her team had already begun to manage the incoming media requests, scheduling interviews, and making sure the narrative stayed on course. She couldn't afford to let her emotions dictate her response. This was a defining moment, not just for her, but for the entire cause she represented. Maya knew that what happened next would shape the rest of her career, and possibly even the way the public viewed her nomination for the highest court in the land. That evening, her phone rang again. This time, it was a call from her close friend, Michelle, who had been following the media coverage closely. Maya, Michelle said, her voice laced with concern. "You've got to address this. I know you didn't ask for any of this, but people are talking. You can't just let this go." Maya exhaled deeply, her eyes focused on the horizon outside her apartment window. She was tired, but there was no turning back. "I know," Maya replied, her voice steady. "It's bigger than I thought. But I'm not going to let them control the narrative. I've worked too hard for this." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Michelle spoke, her tone softening. "You've always been the one to rise above. You know this isn't about the fine. It's about something deeper. What happened today isn't just one isolated incident. It's the reflection of how people view Black women in positions of power." Maya's heart skipped a beat. Her thoughts flashed back to the way Judge Carson had dismissed her without a second thought. The frustration she'd felt, the bitterness that had nearly overwhelmed her. But now, in the quiet of her apartment, it was all beginning to crystallize. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every Black woman who had been ignored, belittled, or underestimated. And she wasn't going to let this moment pass without making sure people understood the truth. "I'm going to make a statement," Maya said with determination. "I'll take control of this. It's time for them to understand who I am, who we are." The next day, Maya addressed the press. She stood at the podium, her back straight and her gaze unwavering. The room was packed with journalists and camera crews, all eager to hear her side of the story. The pressure was palpable, but Maya refused to let the tension sway her. As the flash of cameras filled the space, she took a deep breath and began. "Yesterday, I was treated as though my worth was determined by a single mistake, as though my years of hard work, my years of dedication, could be erased by something as insignificant as a minor infraction." Maya paused, letting the words sink in. "But this is about more than just a traffic fine. This is about how people see me, how people see asterisk as asterisk. Black women don't just face bias in the workplace, in the courtroom, or in the streets. We face it every day in ways both subtle and overt." She could feel the weight of the room's attention pressing down on her, but she remained composed. "What happened to me yesterday? What I experienced in that courtroom happens every day to people across this country. It's a reflection of a system that hasn't yet learned to treat people equally. But I am here to change that. I am here because I believe in justice, not just for myself, but for everyone who has been overlooked, underappreciated, or marginalized." Her words echoed in the room, and she could see the shift in the atmosphere. Journalists who had expected a defensive, angry response now sat in silence, their pens poised to capture every word. Maya wasn't angry, not in the way they had expected. She was calm, focused, and in that moment, she felt the power of her voice, of her story, filling the space. I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here for change, she concluded. I will not let this define me, but I will use it to propel me forward. This is not just about one woman's nomination, it's about the need for reform. And I will be at the forefront of that change. As the cameras clicked and the reporters rushed to file their stories, Maya felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had taken the reins of the narrative. What had started as an unjust encounter in a courtroom had now become a moment of reckoning, a moment where she had refused to be silenced, where her voice became the driving force for change. And this was just the beginning. Maya's statement had gone viral. It spread across news networks, social media, and op-ed columns with the force of a tidal wave. People from all walks of life, activists, politicians, and everyday citizens rallied behind her words. Her stance against the subtle injustices faced by Black women, particularly in positions of power, resonated deeply. The support was overwhelming, but it was also a double-edged sword. For every message of encouragement, there were just as many comments seeking to discredit her or undermine her. The backlash was predictable. There were critics who argued that Maya was overreacting, that the traffic stop was a minor incident blown out of proportion. Others questioned whether a Supreme Court nominee should be making a public spectacle of such a trivial matter. They tried to paint her as emotional, as someone who couldn't handle the heat of public scrutiny. They tried to diminish her achievements, to reduce her to the one moment they felt could be used to discredit her. But Maya wasn't fazed. She knew this was part of the process. This was how systems of power worked, by trying to silence those who threatened the status quo. The more they attacked her, the more it became clear to her that her path forward was not just about her, but about a larger fight for equality and recognition. One afternoon, she received a call from a reporter at a major national newspaper. "Ms. Lawson, we're running a follow-up on your press conference," the voice on the other end said. "But I'd like to ask a more personal question, if you don't mind. You've been through a lot over the last few days. How does it feel to know that the country is watching you, waiting for you to respond to every criticism?" Maya paused, considering her answer carefully. She could feel the weight of the moment, the expectations, the scrutiny. She had faced challenges before, but nothing on this scale. "It's not easy," she replied, her voice calm and resolute. "But I'm not here for validation. I'm here to be a voice for those who don't have one. I didn't choose this path because it was easy. I chose it because I believe in justice and I believe in fairness, even when the system doesn't always reflect those values." The reporter asked more questions, each one probing deeper into Maya's personal experiences, but she answered each one with clarity, never backing down. The conversation had started to feel more like a dialogue, a chance to express not only her thoughts on the matter at hand, but also the larger societal issues at play. As the interview ended, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The media whirlwind was exhausting, but she had gained a clarity she hadn't expected. The support she had received from her community and allies had fortified her. It wasn't just about her nomination anymore. It was about creating space for the next generation of Black women to rise and thrive, without the weight of bias and prejudice holding them back. That evening, Maya sat alone in her office, reviewing the press coverage from the day. A colleague had sent her an article that seemed to echo her sentiments, a piece about how the experience of Black women in positions of power was often minimized, reduced to trivial moments. She thought about the significance of the conversation she had with the reporter earlier and about what lay ahead. There was no going back now. Her fight was no longer just about one individual's experience. It was about the systemic changes that needed to take place to ensure that no one else was ever treated the way she had been in that courtroom. The phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from her team. "We need to talk. There's been a development. The hearing for your nomination has been scheduled." Maya smiled faintly. She was ready. The battle was just beginning, but she was more prepared than ever. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on. She wasn't just a nominee anymore, she was a force for change. The news of the hearing came as a jolt of energy, one that Maya had both anticipated and feared. It was the moment of reckoning, the moment when her fate and the future of countless others would be decided. The hearings for her nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court would be held in just a few weeks. For Maya, this was the culmination of everything she had worked for. Her rise from a small-town girl to one of the most influential legal minds in the country had not been easy. Every step had been hard-earned, every victory hard-fought. But now she was facing the full weight of the political system, the media, and a society that had, for too long, turned a blind eye to the struggles of Black women in positions of power. Her team had already begun preparing for the hearings, drafting talking points, reviewing past cases, and organizing her schedule for the grueling days ahead. But Maya knew that the real challenge would be not just answering the questions thrown at her, but navigating the subtle currents of prejudice and bias that ran through the proceedings. She had seen it before, how the voices of people like her were often dismissed, how their achievements were questioned, how their very presence was scrutinized in ways that others were not. She had faced this her whole life, but now it was on a national stage, and the stakes had never been higher. As the days passed, Maya found herself immersed in preparation. She spent long hours at her desk, reviewing case files, discussing legal precedents with her advisors, and rehearsing her responses to the tough questions she would undoubtedly face. But even as she immersed herself in the technicalities of the law, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play here. It wasn't just about legal qualifications, it was about her identity. The questions she would face weren't just about her legal expertise. They were about who she was as a Black woman, a woman who had fought every day for recognition and respect in a world that often overlooked or outright rejected her. Late one night, after hours of reading and reviewing, Maya stood up and walked to the window of her office. She gazed out at the city skyline, the lights twinkling in the distance. She thought about the countless people who had come before her, the trailblazers who had fought for justice, equality, and representation. She thought about the young girls watching her from across the country, seeing someone who looked like them take center stage. This moment wasn't just for her. It was for them, too. For every Black woman who had ever felt the sting of prejudice, the pain of being overlooked, the exhaustion of fighting to be seen. As she stood there, lost in thought, her phone buzzed again. It was a text from Michelle. "We're all behind you. Don't forget why you're doing this. You're not just fighting for your seat. You're fighting for all of us." Maya smiled softly, her resolve hardening. She had known this from the beginning. This was bigger than her. It was about the legacy she would leave, the doors she would open, and the barriers she would break down for others. She had already proven herself in the courtroom and the legal field, but now she would prove something far more important, that a Black woman could occupy the highest office in the land and still fight for the very people who had once been kept outside. The next morning, she arrived at her office to find a stack of papers waiting for her. The hearings were official, the schedule set. She glanced at the list of senators who would be questioning her, her mind already preparing for the tough debates that lay ahead. There would be the expected questions about her legal philosophy, her views on the Constitution, her stance on controversial issues. But Maya knew that many of those questions would carry a hidden weight, questions about her identity, her background, and whether a Black woman truly belonged at the highest level of the nation's legal system. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced these questions her whole life. She had learned to stand tall, to speak her truth, and to fight for what was right. Now it was time to stand before the nation and show them exactly who Maya Lawson was. The hearing would be a battleground, but it would also be a chance to show the world that her presence in the Supreme Court was not just a historic achievement. It was a statement that change was coming. The fight was far from over, but she was ready. The world was about to see that Maya Lawson was more than just a nominee. She was a force that would shape the future. The day of the hearings arrived, and Maya stood at the front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The room was packed with senators, cameras, and reporters, their eyes trained on her as she sat in the witness chair. This was her moment. A chance to solidify her place in history, to prove to the world, and to herself, that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. Her team had prepared her for this, had prepped her for the tough questions, the scrutiny, and the inevitable attempts to undermine her. But Maya knew this wasn't just about answering questions. This was about confronting the very biases that had shaped her journey, about challenging the assumptions and doubts that had always surrounded her. It was about showing the world that a black woman, a woman who had fought her entire life for recognition and equality, could stand at the highest levels of justice and hold her ground. The first few hours of the hearing passed in a blur. Senators took turns questioning her, each one asking about her legal philosophy, her judicial record, and her views on landmark cases. Maya answered with poise and confidence, her voice steady as she explained her perspective on the law and her commitment to upholding justice. But as the questions grew more pointed, more personal, she could feel the subtle undercurrents of bias. The questions about her background, her race, and her identity came one after the other, veiled in a guise of concern. One senator, an older man with a long history in politics, leaned forward with a smirk. "Ms. Lawson," he began, "while your qualifications are impressive, some might question whether your background and experiences truly prepare you for the impartiality required on the Supreme Court. Do you believe your personal experiences might affect your ability to be objective in cases involving race and equality?" Maya's heart beat steadily in her chest. She had anticipated this question. She knew it was coming. She had faced it before, in every courtroom, in every boardroom, and in every step of her career. She took a deep breath, her mind clear. "Senator," she began, her voice firm but measured, "my experiences have shaped who I am, but they have also taught me the importance of impartiality. I do not approach the law through the lens of personal bias, but through the lens of fairness and justice. My background has given me a unique perspective on the challenges many people face, but that is not a weakness. It is a strength. It allows me to understand the nuances of the law and the ways in which it impacts real people, not just abstract principles." She paused, looking directly at the senator, making sure her words landed. "I have spent my entire career fighting for justice. I have fought for the underrepresented, the marginalized, and the overlooked. I have been in the trenches and I've seen how the law can either uplift or oppress. That is why I am here today, not despite my experiences, but because of them." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She could see some of the senators nodding, as if they understood exactly what she was saying. Others, however, appeared uneasy, as if they weren't quite sure how to respond. But Maya wasn't concerned with their discomfort. She was concerned with the millions of people who were watching this moment, who were seeing her take a stand. She wasn't just representing herself. She was representing every person who had ever been judged by their appearance, their race, or their background. And she wasn't going to let them down. The questioning continued, but Maya answered each one with confidence, her calm demeanor never wavering. She knew the eyes of the nation were upon her, but she also knew that this was bigger than her. It wasn't just about this hearing. It was about the future. It was about the doors she was opening for the next generation of women, of people of color, of anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. When the hearing finally concluded, the room emptied out, but Maya remained seated for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had done it. She had stood firm, answered every question, and made her case. The fight was far from over. There would be more debates, more votes to cast. But for the first time in a long time, Maya felt the weight of history lifting from her shoulders. She had stepped into the spotlight, not just as a nominee, but as a symbol of change. And no matter what came next, she knew that her story, and the stories of countless others like her, had already begun to shift the narrative. She wasn't just a woman in a courtroom or a judge on a bench. She was the future of justice,